Welcome to Relationship Reset with life coach Dr. Mark Shook. In each podcast, Mark will weave together the ancient truths of Scripture with the latest cutting-edge neuroscience in short, concise, effective, and doable principles and actions to reset your relationship dynamic.
Hello, welcome to Relationship Reset. I'm Pastor Mark Shook, your life coach and fellow struggler as we're trying to figure out how to make relationships work, taking relationships to the next level. We've been talking about internal family systems. We've been talking about exiles and managers and firefighters. I want to bring this all the way back around to attachment style that we talked about in our first set of podcasts. You remember that early attachment plays a critical role in how we learn to deal with things as an adult. And most of our fights aren't with each other as a couple, they're with our past. So we're looking at attachment style and soul fragments. You know, you remember those attachment styles that they develop in early childhood based on the relationship between a child and their primary caregivers. The way caregivers respond to a child's needs, whether consistently, inconsistently, neglectfully, it shapes how the child learns to relate to others emotionally, and their attachment style, it is shaped by that. So I want us to, again, just to remember, let's break down anxious, avoidant, disorganized attachment styles and how they can lead to the development of parts in the internal family systems model. Think about anxious attachment. An anxious attachment style develops when caregivers are inconsistent in meeting the child's emotional needs. Sometimes the caregiver is attentive, but at other times they may be distracted or unavailable. And this unpredictability makes the child feel unsure about whether they can rely on their caregiver for support. As a result, the child becomes preoccupied with getting the caregiver's attention and validation, fearing abandonment. You remember that? Well, let's think of some parts that might develop. What are the manager parts that might come out of this? These might be a hyper-focus on pleasing others or seeking reassurance. An anxious child may develop parts that work hard to gain approval and avoid abandonment, such as that people-pleaser part that's always trying to keep others happy. What would the firefighter parts be of an anxious person in times of high distress? When reassurance isn't available, anxious individuals might develop a self-soothing firefighter part that distracts them from overwhelming feelings through impulsive actions, overeating, engaging in risky behavior to cope. What about the exiles? What are the wounded parts? An exile part in someone with anxious attachment might carry deep fears of rejection or abandonment, believing I'm not worthy unless I'm loved. And this part may be triggered in situations where the person feels insecure in relationships. See, what you have to remember is this protective mechanism helps you survive as a child, but then you grow up, you're no longer powerless. And even if you're in perfectly safe circumstances because of your history, you still go into fight or flight mode anyway. Depending on what you've been through in the past, it's going to make it difficult to maintain healthy relationships or deal with any other areas of life that mimic old trauma or trigger you, like your marriage or any close relationship. I read recently that 80% of women have been betrayed sexually by someone they trust deeply by the time they're 18. You know, just that one thing alone can cause fragmenting. In fact, it surely will. So as adults, if you have that anxious attachment, you may constantly seek validation in relationships. You may become overly occupied with others' attention. You might feel anxious when you're apart from your loved one, or fear that your relationship will fall apart without constant reassurance. If you have that avoidant attachment that develops when caregivers are emotionally unavailable or dismissive, and they discourage emotional expression or overly focused on independence, as a result, the child learns that expressing emotions won't lead to comfort or support. And to cope, the child becomes emotionally self-reliant, suppressing their feelings to avoid disappointment. And what are some of the parts that might develop from that avoidant attachment? Well, the manager parts, an avoidant child might develop a self-sufficient manager part that focuses on independence and emotional control. And this part may insist that emotions are a sign of weakness, and so you're going to avoid showing vulnerability at all costs. What are the firefighter parts? Maybe an emotional disconnection or behaviors like binge watching TV, working excessively, using substances to numb feelings, because they block the exile's emotional needs from suffering. And what is the wound of the exiles? An exile part might carry feelings of unmet emotional needs or deep loneliness that's hidden away by protective parts that believe vulnerability leads to rejection, because that's its experience in the past. As adults, those with avoidant attachment might struggle with intimacy and emotional closeness. They might avoid deep conversations and reject offers of help or downplay their emotions, believing that depending on others is dangerous or unproductive. I'm a rock, I'm an island, could be their theme song. Now, disorganized attachment, we didn't talk a lot about because it comes from trauma. It develops when a child's caregiver is both a source of comfort and fear. Typically happens in abusive, neglectful, or unpredictable relationships with a parent. Maybe the parent's loving one moment but harmful the next, and the child doesn't know how to respond because the caregiver is unreliable and may present both care and danger. Excuse me. Parts that develop, a manager part in this kind of situation might become a hypervigilant protector, constantly scanning for danger and trying to prevent chaos. This part may cause the individual to always feel on edge, prepared for the worst, even in situations that don't require such intense vigilance. And then what are the firefighter parts in disorganized attachment? Because of the overwhelming and confusing emotions tied to their caregivers, the individual might develop firefighter parts that just shut down emotions entirely. This could lead to dissociation, emotional numbness, or even risky behaviors to avoid feeling pain. And what's the wound that the exiles carry in disorganized attachment? Feelings of deep confusion and fear. These exiles often hold traumatic memories and extreme emotional pain because the caregivers were supposed to provide love and safety, but instead inflicted harm. Adults with disorganized attachment might find themselves trapped in a pattern of seeking closeness and then pushing others away. I call it the pull-push. Pull you in, but no, it's not safe, push you out. They have trouble trusting others or themselves in relationships. It can lead to volatile or unpredictable behavior in romantic or personal relationships as internal parts oscillate between seeking connection and fearing them. You know, we talked a little in a past podcast about the neuroscientific influences on development, but what about in attachment? Attachment styles influence the development of part through neural pathways, neurons that fire together, wire together. Anxious attachment, the child's brain learns to anticipate emotional distress, causing heightened activation in the amygdala, the fear center, leading to hypervigilance, overactive parts that constantly seek reassurance. The avoidant attachment, the prefrontal cortex might try to take over to suppress emotional responses, leading to parts that focus on logic and control rather than emotional expression. And in disorganized attachment, early trauma affects the brain's ability to integrate emotions, causing fragmentation between parts of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, the memory, threat. This can lead to really fragmented, more extreme fragmented parts. So what's the role that parts play in early attachment dynamics? See, parts develop to navigate the child's relationship with their caregiver. So depending on the child's experience with attachment, the parts might develop in adaptive or maladaptive ways. Like manager parts in attachment. Manager parts develop to prevent the child from feeling emotional pain or rejection. In an insecure attachment scenario, a manager part might take on the role of keeping the child's behavior in check, ensuring they behave in a way that keeps the caregiver pleased or at a distance. For example, a child with an avoidant attachment might develop a manager part that emphasizes independence and emotional self-reliance, avoiding any situation that requires emotional vulnerability because that was met with neglect or rejection in early life. Those firefighter parts emerge when the child feels overwhelmed by emotional distress, especially if the caregiver is absent or harmful. In cases of trauma or disorganized attachment, the child may develop firefighter parts that act impulsively to numb intense emotions, self-soothing behaviors, retreating into fantasy worlds to cope with the unpredictability of their environment. And those exile parts in attachment, they carry the deep emotional wounds from early experiences of neglect, abandonment, emotional unavailability. Insecurely attached children may have exiles that hold painful memories of crying out for help and being ignored, or of reaching out for comfort and being rejected. These exiles often remain hidden, only surfacing when something in the present triggers the feelings of loss or abandonment from childhood. And the manager and firefighter parts work hard to keep these exiles from surfacing because their emotions are just too overwhelming. Just an example, if a child frequently felt abandoned by an emotionally distant parent, an exile part might carry the belief, I'm not worthy of love. But that exile is pushed down by the system with managers and firefighters preventing it from surfacing because that's just too painful to confront. However, as an adult, situations that even remotely resemble rejection may trigger this exile, causing overwhelming feelings of sadness or abandonment. So you can see how these two things, they just fit together. Attachment theory and internal family systems theory. Both of them go together, and it happens as a child is trying to survive, trying to connect with that early caregiver, all in the right side of the brain where those little emotional, those neuronic knots form. And if we see them as that little one stuck in time, we can begin to have compassion for them. And compassion is the first big step toward healing. I want you to be thinking about maybe what some of your firefighters are, some of your managers are. What is the exile parts of you that carry those deep wounds? If you can't figure out what they are, think of your modern day triggers. Think of the triggers that you have right now, because those triggers will give you the biggest clue. When you overreact, when you should be at a 2 on a scale of 1 to 10 and you react at an 11 in an argument, you're having an emotional flashback and you're going back to that right side of the brain, and one of those younger things is taking over, those younger parts, those younger soul fragments. So think about that this next few days. We're going to jump into how this affects marriage. And then we're going to start looking at some specific examples. Maybe up till now you thought, I don't know if I quite understand it all. Well, we'll get some super specific examples. We'll even take a couple of podcasts just going through examples of what that might look like. And I promise you, you're going to recognize yourself in those examples. It'll help you to know what you're dealing with. And then we're also going to learn how to deal with them. It's called the U-turn. It's going inside. Instead of focusing outward on the other person, you go inside to figure out why you're feeling like you're feeling. It's really powerful, and it's going to bring a lot of healing to your marriage. We'll see you soon.